continuing through our series on the sayings of Jesus, and we have come to day 5, which is found in John chapter 19, verse 28. And it says this: after Jesus, knowing that all was finished, he said to fulfill the scripture, "I thirst." When we arrive at John 19, Jesus has been betrayed. He's been handed over to the authorities. He has been tried and convicted, and he hangs on a cross and is suffering. And in his pain of thirst and abandonment and death, we see his suffering. We, as people, struggle to make sense of our own pain and suffering and grief in the world. And so we have to ask ourselves, how could it be, and why is it that God would subject himself to such hardship? In writing about his own pain and suffering and loss, C.S. Lewis says these words. He says, "Not that I am in much danger of ceasing to believe in God, but the real danger is of coming to believe dreadful things about him." He says, "The conclusion that I dread is not, so there is no God after all. The conclusion I dread is to look at God and say, so this is what he's really like." And John 19 says, "I will show you what God is really like. He's a God who thirsts." Why would he do this? Why would the Lord himself suffer? Hebrews 4 says that God endures suffering to enter into our suffering. It was for the joy set before him that he endured the cross. If you'll remember with me back a few weeks ago to Super Bowl Sunday, I'll have to confess that my favorite part of the Super Bowl are the commercials. And if you remember, some of the commercials this year were funny, some reminiscent, some serious. But the one that I remember the most is the Jessica Long story. Maybe you remember this one. She's a Paralympic athlete. And the commercial goes back to the very beginning of her story, when her adoptive mom gets a call from the adoption agency. And the person on the other end of the line says, "Mrs. Long, we found your baby girl for adoption, but there are some things you need to know. She's in Siberia. She was born with a rare condition. Her legs will need to be amputated. I know this is difficult to hear. Her life won't be easy." And do you remember what her mom said? Her response was, "It might not be easy, but it'll be amazing. I can't wait to meet her." In longing for a child, she enters into all of what the journey of having a child means. For the joy set before her, she rejoiced. This is what Jesus is like. David Ortland says about the character of God, Jesus cannot ungentle himself towards you. And why is the God of all creation gentle towards you? Because he entered into the world with you. He entered into your suffering. Jesus never promises that his people will not suffer, but he does promise that he will be with you in your suffering. David Brooks says, what suffering does is open you up and remind you that you aren't the person that you thought you were. And I think this is great news. It means that you aren't your greatest achievement, but it also means you aren't your deepest disappointment. Who you are is a child of God who is so precious to Jesus that he would suffer with you. The Christian psychologist John Cox, who I love to read and listen to, talks about how pain is healed. And he says this, he says, with is God's favorite preposition. If your pain is with me and I see you and I hold you and I'm together with you, something about our pain gets better. He says, with heals pain. So what is God like? He's a God who's with you. A God who has entered in so that he could thirst. So that he could suffer. So he could defeat sin and death. And why? So you and I can be with him forever. Jesus was forsaken so you could be welcomed. He was rejected so you could belong. He suffered so that one day you and I in glory will be whole, will be healed. And that's the hope that we carry with us each day, because that is what God is like.